Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack complex topics using the sources you share, aiming for clarity and insight. Today, we're tackling the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. We're going beyond the headlines to look at the deep-seated geopolitical issues keeping things so volatile.
Yeah, and the sources you sent over give us a really useful way to start thinking about this. A framework, actually. It helps organize the motivations of the key players involved. It gets us straight into the core strategies.
Okay, great. Let's lay out that framework right now. The sources use this powerful four-part analogy to define each major actor's role and mindset.
That's right, the four fires analogy. So it goes like this. The U.S. is seen as lighting the fire. Russia, feeling cornered by this, is described as catching fire. Then you have the main European powers, France and Germany mostly, trying desperately to extinguish the fire. And finally, Ukraine itself, tragically, is suffering from what the sources call internal burning or just quiet suffering.
That breakdown, the lighter, the catcher, the extinguisher, and the sufferer, it really does clarify the conflicting interests right away. So our mission today is twofold. First, let's unpack the often cynical motivations behind these roles. And then we need to dive into four specific, deep systemic ailments that the experts in these sources say pretty much guarantee this whole situation stays incredibly complicated.
Okay, let's kick off with the U.S. role, the designated fire starter.
Yeah, the analysis here is quite sharp. It suggests the U.S. strategy isn't about direct war anymore, but more about, what's the phrase, fanning the flames. Doing that to maximize American self-interest, basically creating profitable chaos somewhere else.
Exactly, and that analysis points to three, well, let's just say, highly cynical objectives the Biden administration is supposedly pursuing here. First, the sources argue that stirring up external tension is a tried and tested way to, distract Americans from problems at home. Dissatisfaction with governance, policy issues.
Right, so connecting foreign policy moves directly to domestic political management. Okay, what about the economic angle?
That's the second goal, and it's purely financial, according to this view. The idea is that the crisis, the instability it creates in Europe, it's designed to push European capital investment money out of the continent and towards the perceived safety of the U.S. financial system. Wall Street, basically. It's like an engineered capital flight.
Okay, those are the short-term political and economic gains. What's the bigger, long-term geopolitical game plan behind this fire starting?
The third objective is the long game, the strategic one. It's about keeping Europe from becoming truly independent, geopolitically speaking. How? By forcing Europe off its heavy reliance on relatively cheap Russian energy, pushing them towards, well, more expensive U.S. alternatives. The end result, Europe stays strategically dependent on the U.S., kind of subservient, unable to act as a real counterweight to American power.
That's a very, very critical take on U.S. motives. Do the sources get into the potential blowback, the risks, or even the morality of a strategy like that? Or is it just focused on the cold tactics?
It's mainly focused on the tactics and the resulting hypocrisy. You see the U.S. talking up the conflict, right? Troop alerts, weapon shipments, pulling embassy staff, making it look like they're ready to jump in. But according to these sources, there's no will or strength for a direct military fight with Russia. The real aim is containment, maybe profit, but not actually defending Ukraine militarily.
And that perceived hypocrisy, it burst into the open quite dramatically at one point, didn't it?
It really did. Remember when President Biden made that comment about how a small-scale invasion by Russia might be another matter, suggesting, maybe the U.S. wouldn't react forcefully to something limited? The sources say President Zelensky in Ukraine was just stunned, felt completely played. It's a brutal reminder, isn't it? Ukraine isn't a NATO member. The U.S. has absolutely zero treaty obligation to send troops.
Okay, let's shift to Russia, the one catching fire. This isn't just about Ukraine in isolation, is it? It taps into a much deeper fear, a sense of vulnerability going back decades.
Oh, absolutely. Russia's stance makes a lot more sense when you trace it back to their collective memory after the Soviet Union collapsed. There's this profound feeling of being humiliated, strategically squeezed by NATO constantly pushing eastward. And they insist this expansion directly broke promises made to Soviet leaders back in the early 90s. The forces even mentioned this, well, it's a pretty crude analogy a Russian official supposedly used. He described NATO expansion like someone first asking to borrow the garage. Then they move into the house, and finally they say, actually, I want to sleep with your wife. It's blunt, but it captures that Russian feeling of escalating encroachment right up to their doorstep.
Wow. Okay, that feeling of being boxed in, it explains the massive military buildup we saw and those three really firm red lines Russia laid down for NATO. Can you remind us what those demands were?
Yeah, they were crystal clear. First, a permanent, legally binding ban preventing Ukraine from ever joining NATO, full stop.
Uh-huh.
Second, NATO had to immediately stop deploying offensive weapon systems anywhere near Russia's borders. And third, they demanded NATO roll back its military presence in Eastern Europe, basically return to the level seen before 1997.
Okay, let's turn to Europe now, the ones trying to be the extinguisher. We definitely see major players like Germany and France hesitant to just fall in line with the U.S. approach. Why is Europe so keen on finding its own way to de-escalate?
Well, for them, the stakes feel much more immediate, almost existential. Europe, especially Germany, is heavily reliant on Russian gas and oil. They really worry about getting locked into a U.S.-led anti-Russia strategy that just doesn't serve their own economic needs. Plus, any real conflict would be catastrophic for their economies, which are already struggling, right? Recession fears, high energy prices, pandemic recovery. A war next door would be devastating.
And we saw that reluctance expressed pretty vividly with that whole German aid story.
Oh yeah, the helmets. That was quite something. It perfectly symbolized Europe's awkward position. When Germany offered just 5,000 helmets, Kyiv's mayor apparently just exploded, sarcastically asking if they planned to send pillows next. That small detail really highlighted the diplomatic tension.
And Europe's push for its own solution led to things like the Normandy format talks. For listeners maybe not familiar, what's the significance of that format?
Right, the Normandy format. It's basically a diplomatic group with Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. Its whole purpose is to resolve the conflict simmering in eastern Ukraine's Donbas region. And the key thing here, they were trying to keep the Minsk ceasefire agreements alive without the U.S. in the room. That exclusion really signals Europe's desire for a separate, continental path to de-escalation.
Which brings us inevitably to Ukraine itself, the nation caught in the middle, suffering that internal burning. The sources paint a really tragic picture, don't they? A country seemingly unable to control its own fate, constantly destabilized by political turmoil, like the so-called color revolutions.
It's a story of such wasted potential. I mean, think about it. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe by landmass. It has these incredibly rich, black soil farmlands. And it inherited a massive industrial base from the Soviet era. We're talking Antonov cargo planes, advanced T-80 tanks, powerful jet engines, even the hull of the Varyag, the aircraft carrier that China eventually bought and turned into their first carrier, the Liaoning. That came from Ukraine.
But the economic reality now,
Yeah.
it's staggering when you look back. The sources point out that in 1991, right after independence, Ukraine's GDP per person was 5 times higher than China's. Today, it's less than 1/3 of China's. The entire Ukrainian economy is smaller than just one Chinese city, Tianjin. It's unbelievable.
And that economic collapse is mirrored by, or maybe fueled by, this deep internal political split. The sources really emphasize this division. You've got the Western regions, strongly pro-Western, versus the Eastern regions, which have traditionally closer ties to Russia. It's almost symbolized by the blue and yellow on their flag, pulling in different directions. The argument in the sources is that the Western political model, when imposed on this divided society, actually makes the split worse. It almost guarantees that roughly half the population feels alienated, which just feeds instability.
And you see that lack of real political autonomy so starkly. I mean, the sources describe Ukrainian MPs actually waving American and British flags inside their own parliament during a presidential speech, protesting. The consensus seems to be that the best path for Ukraine, staying neutral, keeping balance between Russia and the West, is just. It's practically impossible now because of all these external pressures.
Yeah, and that tragedy, that internal division and external manipulation, it leads us straight into the deeper systemic problems, because this crisis isn't just about recent events. It's rooted in these fundamental structural issues. The experts identify 4 key ailments, making this whole thing so complex and persistent.
Okay, let's break those down. The first one sounds like it points the finger directly at leadership choices. What's elites betting national destiny?
This describes a really dangerous pattern where Ukrainian leaders, over time, have basically treated their own country like a bargaining chip.
Yeah.
They try to intentionally escalate tensions, play the victim card, hoping to drag bigger powers like NATO and the U.S. into what the sources call a hostage dilemma, forcing them to intervene. But this kind of high-stakes gambling has just hollowed out national autonomy and, frankly, fueled massive political corruption along the way.
And the sources stress that this isn't the first time a smaller country might have miscalculated U.S. willingness to bail them out, right?
Exactly. That's part of the ailment, this failure to learn from history. They point to the U.S. effectively abandoning Georgia during its 2008 war with Russia, or the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. The analysis sees this reliance on distant great powers as a recurring, self-defeating strategy.
Okay, the second ailment. This one seems to go back further, to a fundamental mistake made right after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, this is called the illusory choice. The idea is that after 1991, countries like Ukraine were essentially forced into a false black and white decision. You either fully align with the West or you fully align with Russia, zero sum. But this completely ignored Ukraine's actual history and geography as this complex Eurasian civilizational nexus, a crossroads connecting different worlds. Because the country is internally divided, forcing it to pick one side just guarantees endless friction and keeps the state fragile. The experts basically see this whole crisis as a huge, unresolved leftover, a residue of the Cold War.
That makes a lot of sense. If you force a split country to choose one side definitively, you're baking in conflict. Okay, ailment number 3 touches on ideology.
This one's called monopolized historical correctness. The argument here is that the West pushed this very rigid idea of linear development. They insisted that the only legitimate or successful path for post-Soviet states was to adopt Western-style liberal democracy. No alternatives considered valid. This kind of ideological certainty makes it easy to label anyone who deviates, like Russia, as a revisionist state. And it's this mindset, the sources argue, that justifies things like imposing, over 50 rounds of sanctions just related to the Ukraine issue.
So that ideological inflexibility limits diplomatic options and really defines the adversarial stance.
Thank you.
And the final ailment. This one's described as the biggest geopolitical factor, stretching beyond Europe.
Right, this is the U.S. strategy of dual evil constraint. This is really key to understanding current global tensions, according to these sources. The U.S. is seen as deliberately linking the Ukraine crisis and the Taiwan issue, treating them as connected chess pieces on a global board, the goal, to pressure both Moscow and Beijing at the same time. And this deliberate linkage helps create these potentially misleading narratives, like we're in a new Cold War, or that there's some kind of formal authoritarian alliance forming.
That's a significant claim, intentionally linking these two potential flashpoints as part of global strategy. So what does this U.S. approach mean for the Asia-Pacific? Let's look at the fallout for China, Russia, and Taiwan. We know China's official line, the sources say, is calling for calm dialogue, trying not to escalate things.
Yes, but the major, perhaps unintended consequence of this U.S. dual constraint strategy has been to push China and Russia much closer together. Trying to contain both simultaneously using Ukraine and Taiwan seems to have backfired, forging a stronger back-to-back strategic partnership between them. They've even publicly stated their cooperation has no ceiling and no restricted areas, and their joint statements now explicitly oppose NATO expansion. That's a big shift.
Definitely a significant geopolitical realignment. Now, how is Taiwan viewing all this drama in Eastern Europe, especially given that the U.S. itself is making the comparison?
Well, the sources describe extreme anxiety in pro-independence circles in Taiwan. It's specifically triggered by the U.S. clearly stating it wouldn't send troops to defend Ukraine. They seem focused on two big worries. First, could a Russian military move somehow trigger a parallel move by Beijing against Taiwan? And maybe more fundamentally, what does the U.S. refusal to fight for Ukraine actually mean for Taiwan's own security guarantee from the U.S.? They're worried the precedent suggests the U.S. might not intervene militarily for them either.
It really sounds like the U.S. strategy of linking the two situations might be creating more instability and actually uniting its perceived adversaries.
That seems to be the argument presented here. And one last point on this. The sources mention specific U.S. interference in China-Ukraine relations. Apparently, even though China was willing to help Ukraine with infrastructure projects, there was even an agreement signed. The U.S. has actively stepped in to prevent that kind of normal economic cooperation, further limiting Ukraine's options.
So, wrapping this all up, the Ukraine crisis really stands as this powerful and frankly catastrophic example of what can happen when a nation's fate gets dictated by these huge external power struggles. It prevents them from taking what most analysts would say is the most rational path, genuine neutrality, keeping an equal distance from the big powers.
And the economic devastation is just immense. The whole story really underlines how internal political divisions, when they're exploited and worsened by outside interference, can completely destroy a nation's prosperity, its industrial strength. It's a truly stark lesson for any country caught in the geopolitical crossfire.
Indeed. You know, the source material brings up how historically difficult it is to create a stable buffer state, Belgium, between France and Germany being one rare success. It makes you wonder, If this intense external pressure keeps preventing Ukraine from developing the political unity and maturity needed to enforce real neutrality, the kind of path someone like Kissinger suggested might be wise. Is the country just doomed to be this perpetual geopolitical dead end? And not that diplomacy or even force just can't untie. That's the heavy question these sources leave us with, something for you to really think about.